Welcome to the Carousel of Happiness podcast. I'm your host, Nick Alexander. Last time around, we spoke with George Blevins about humor, humility, and how he came to help Scott Harrison illustrate some of the carousel animals into existence.
Scott came to me one day and said, "Draw me a pig." He meant a pig as a carousel figure that he would then carve.
As it happens, this episode is being published on George Blevins Day, Saturday, August 1st, 2026. So if it isn't too late, come by the carousel, talk with George and Scott, play a few games, and leave with a free copy of one of George's anthologies of his Cabin Fever comic. The event continues tomorrow on August 2nd. Then next weekend on the 8th and 9th, the Carousel of Happiness will be offering free carousel rides for everyone in honor of Mary Quinlan Wingate. So while there may be no such thing as a free lunch, free books and free carousel rides are apparently very much within the realm of possibility. In this episode, we'll be getting to know another longtime friend of the carousel, Burt Rashbaum, who is a poet and an operator of the Carousel of Happiness. You may remember him from this podcast's debut episode, where we got to hear how he introduced the carousel to new visitors.
So this carousel you are about to get on is completely hand-carved by one man alone. It took him only 26 years to carve it, and the reason he carved it was to heal himself from something called the Vietnam War.
Then, on episode 18, titled Lessons on Art and Grieving, our original host, Allie Wagner, told Burt Rashbaum's story in depth.
He spent his entire life as a student of the world, and now he's got a story he just can't crack.
Today, Burt and I are talking about poetry, both his and the carousel's. Like happiness, joy, whimsy, butterflies, and other wonderful things, poetry can be hard to pin down. So instead of trying to do that myself, I'll leave it to some people who are more qualified. Samuel Taylor Coleridge called poetry the best words in the best order. William Wordsworth said, "Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility." And Emily Dickinson said, "If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that it is poetry." They certainly have a way with words. All poets do, and Burt is no exception. So let me stop talking and allow him to start. Let us begin with today's story.
This is actually the first poem of my book called Of the Carousel, which was conceived as an attempt to portray the magic that I, as an operator in the middle, sees going around me. But this first poem is before we open. So it's written for the big empty carousel and what's about to happen. A massive mammoth silence awaits the unleashing of joy, a menagerie of wooden beasts frozen in pose will come alive, creak its 26 tons, yawn and groan to bear the weight of laughter and tears and pain, waiting for the first riders to appear at the gate.
Wonderful, and I love that, well, right now it's about 10:15 a.m. The carousel has not yet opened. All those animals are waiting right now, so it feels very appropriate. Thank you for sharing. Could you tell me a bit more about this book? So it's Of the Carousel.
It's called Of the Carousel, and the idea, my original idea, which is so harebrained, but I thought, because I'd been working at the carousel for at least a decade when this started to happen, I'm in the middle and I'm watching people go around me, and I watch all kinds of things happening that I describe as magic. And so I thought, I'm going to try to capture the magic in one poem and make every stanza about one rider. And I'm only going to write it when I'm working at the carousel and while the carousel is spinning. But I tried this. I might have done it 3 or 4 times. And Blue Owl Books, which is our little bookstore in town, used to have a monthly poetry reading. So the host one night said to everyone who stayed after, "Does anyone have anything new?" And I said, I'm working on something. And I explained, and I read my 4 or 5 stanzas about this idea I had. And when I finished, there was no reaction. It like went over everyone's head. And I was waiting for someone to say something, and people kind of nodded. And I was getting ready to leave thinking, well, that didn't work. And he came over to me and he said, "Burt, I don't know exactly what you're planning to do with what you read, but I think you have something there and you should stick with it." So I went home thinking about what he said, and I realized every stanza wasn't enough, and every stanza needs to be its own poem.
Mm.
And so I spent the next year writing these poems, and some of them are specific to things I'd actually seen at the carousel. Some of them were answers to sort of riddles that stymied me when I would see certain kinds of activity at the carousel. And when I was finished, I had a collection of poetry. And I found this publisher called the Poets Press. They're out of Pittsburgh. And, I submit stuff all the time. And I submitted it to him. And he said, "Well, I don't know if it'll actually work, but you could send the poems to me. I'll take a look and we'll see what I think." So I sent him the manuscript, and a few months went by and he wrote me back and he said, "I liked it." So he said, "I'm attaching a PDF of what I want to do with this book." And so he came up with the title of the carousel. He removed all my titles of the poetry. He took out the page numbers. There's no index. A lot of book of poetries have a first line index at the end. And he said to me, "What I see in your poems is one day at the carousel, from opening to closing." And so instead of having titles, I numbered them. And as the day wears on, the numbers go up. And he also chose a font for the numbers that are as old as the carousel. They were invented in like 1915 or something. And my daughter-in-law had taken photographs just with my idea that maybe they could go with the poems in some way. And he laid out the whole book with her pictures at the right place, reflecting that poem that mentions that animal. And I read the whole thing, and I thought, he turned it into this book. And that's where it came from. And I've sold over 900 copies at the carousel so far.
Wow.
And makes him happy, but it makes me happy. And I sign books for people, and I always explain how the numbers are not, there's no titles, there's numbers and what it's about. And you can't see this on the podcast, everyone out there, but the first poem and the last poem are written in the shape of the carousel. So that's the 2 halves, and that's the gate. And at the end, there's one poem that's in the shape of sort of a circle.
Wow.
And I'm very pleased with it. And I every now and then I just open it up and I'll read one and I'll think, boy, that's not bad. I think I did a pretty good job here.
Think that we can be our own harshest critics of our art. So when the person who wrote it says, "Hey, that's not bad," you might really be onto something then.
I might be onto something, yes.
I think so. 900 books later, congratulations. And what a nice story about a poem is just a poem. Well, what I'm saying is the relationship of your editor and the publisher, and how the presentation of the poetry is part of the art too. And it seems like it came together really nicely with it. So I realize I haven't really asked for an introduction of yourself, but that might be partly because, for one, poetry, it's a reflection of your soul, right? So you've been introducing yourself through your poetry. And then for 2, we already got to meet you on a previous episode of this podcast. So I'll link to it in the show notes. But in season 1, our original host, Ali Wagner, interviewed you and told a really powerful story about your life and your relationship to the carousel. So check that story out if you want to hear more about Burt. But could you tell me a little introduction to yourself now?
Well, I'm originally from New York City, Brooklyn, New York. And I came to Colorado 50 years ago, next month, 1976. I was living in Buffalo with my girlfriend, who became my wife. We moved here together. I went to college at the State University of New York at Buffalo, where I studied creative writing and poetry. And I've been writing poetry seriously for over 50 years. So when I came to Colorado, I continued and eventually got a master's at CU. I worked at CU Boulder for over 31 years as an administrative staff for the College of Arts and Sciences. But the whole time I was writing both poetry and fiction, and then moved to Netherlands in 1984 with my wife. And in 2007, there was a little newspaper that a woman was trying to get off the ground, not the Mountaineer, which had been going strong. She was trying to go up against the Mountaineer. And we were friends, and she hired me to be the editor and also a reporter. So every week I had to do an editorial, and I helped with the layout of the paper every week. And in searching for ideas about what to put in that little paper, she was friends with Scott. And she said, there's a carousel that's going to happen here in a couple of years. Let's do some stories about the carver, and we'll get pictures of the animals that are already finished, etc. So we did a few stories, and that's where I got to meet Scott, and I started to understand what this would probably be, although until you see it finished, you really can't even imagine that. But it makes us for some great stories. And one night, they had an open house at one of the empty storefronts at our former shopping center where they were going to introduce some animals, and Scott would be there, and they had a sign-up sheet for volunteers. So my wife and I went down and we signed up. I thought this would be pretty cool as a way to volunteer in the community. So we started as we would work together. We started as volunteers in the gift shop. But after a few months, I realized the fun is in that big room with all those animals. That's where the real fun is. And one day, I live right down the street. I was home and she was here for some reason. And one of the operators who started on opening day, after about 5 or 6 months, decided, this is not really for me. And I think I'm going to let this go. And so he decided to stop being an operator. She called me up right away and said, one of the operators just quit. And I said, tell them I'll be right down. So I ran down here and got hired. And so, but throughout the whole time, I continued to write and publish. And so I use the carousel time that I'm in there on my shifts as a creative act. It's just something I do. And the carousel is all about stories. So I love telling the story in my storyteller's voice. I have some experience in theater going back to my college days and before that. And I like meeting strangers. And it's a safe place where once I start interacting with folks who I don't know as an operator and either telling the story of the carousel or my own story, they begin sharing their story. And it's a place where stories get traded and tears get shed and there's a lot of laughter. And I am honored in a way to be an agent of that occurring. So that's who I am. And now that I'm retired from the university, I often call the carousel, when I speak to folks, one of my retirement gigs, because I do a few other creative things as well. But it's something that literally feeds my soul, whatever that might mean. But for a poet, it just means it helps my being continue to shine in a way.
Wow. I think it's an all-you-can-eat buffet for the soul because, well, very nice. Thank you for sharing that story. And I was going to ask, how did the carousel come to you? But you answered already. So you're part of a very elite group of the operators, right? Can you tell me what it's like to be part of that team?
You know, it's interesting that you say part of that team because as an operator, you work alone. So I rarely talk to the other operators more than a few minutes here and there. But I know that they have the same sort of experience on their level from where they're at and where they're coming from that I do when I am an operator. So I do feel like, in a way, it's an elite team because we're all doing something very, very special. And what I love to do on occasion when I have folks from out of town, even my grandson, who I bring in on Thursdays, is to come in as a rider and then listen and watch as the operator, who's a friend of mine, no matter whether it's Fred or John or Rebecca or Charles, and see how they do it coming from where they're coming from. And it's all a little different. Your genuine self. And so it's interesting to be part of a group of folks who get to have the opportunity to be their true selves in a situation, again, that's safe, that's very often, most of the time, talking to strangers. And so it is sort of an elite of people who have a rare, rare opportunity. And I'm just pleased to be on the team.
Cool. How many years is it now for you since you started?
Well, I started on opening day again as a volunteer,
Sure.
But I started as an operator in the fall, September of 2010. So this September, it'll be 16 years.
Wow. That is quite impressive. Well, thank you for the service to the Carousel and for welcoming so many people to it, and the role you've played in helping the magic take place over 16 years. That must be a lot of magic that's happened. So you mentioned a bit about the poetry community of Ned. Going a little bit broader, it seems like you guys used to meet at the Blue Owl. I know you've worked with the library some. Could you tell me a little bit about poetry in Nederland?
Well, poetry in Netherlands goes back to way before I got here. So it's been a very active, creative community for many, many years. And every year, the Mountaineer does an issue called It's Your Turn. And I've been in there where for that issue, they would just take stories and poetry and photographs and let the readers and the community create the paper. So I was part of that for quite a while. And some of my lifelong friends now are folks in this town who now live in Boulder, let's say. And we're all part of that community. And it's fun to find people who are struggling with an art form or doing an art form that you do because we all do it differently. And so to listen to a bunch of people reading poetry that are so different from what they're about, how they're written, how they're read, the effect they have on an audience. It's quite inspiring. In the chicken place, the Alpine Brick House, I believe it's called now, used to be a little coffee house, and they had quite a number of readings. They used to have poetry slams, which was something that was new to me that I became part of. And now there's a new Bristlecone bookshop in town. I haven't stopped in there yet, but they've done a few poetry readings now. So
good.
The community is expanding, and I know a few very young poets who I've known since they're yay big, knee high to a grasshopper, whatever you might say, and they're now adults, and they're writing poetry and they're reading their poetry and publishing. So it's great to see it carry on and know that it will continue to carry on because this area has always been a very creative community, both with the written word, musically, painting, all kinds of art.
Carving.
There you go. Carving. Gee, if only I knew someone who was a good carver.
Well, have you read Scott's book of haikus?
Oh, yeah.
Do you have any impressions of that?
Haiku, to me, people think haiku is so easy. It's a 3-line poem. It's 13 syllables, whatever it is. Haiku is a very difficult form. And you have to get a lot in those few words. And To me, Scott has done it. And if you want to know something about any one of the animals, all you need are 3 lines from Scott. And so I think it's a great accomplishment. And because it's a small book, people could just take it and just put it right in their pocket and take it with them. And, his other book, Carousel Soul, are these chapters about each animal, which are paragraphs and paragraphs and his narrative and his experience of carving them. But the haikus are an exact evocation of what that animal is, and looking at them as something that has a personality, that has an effect, And so he puts a lot of meaning into just a few words.
Yeah, they're an interesting side-by-side comparison, those two books.
That's it.
Probably one of them has 1/1000th of the words in the other, and yet they're both are equally weighty. I'm glad to hear that there's some young people out there writing poems. I could see it becoming kind of outmoded or old-fashioned seeming. We have short-form video. What do we need a poem for? I already said it in my TikTok. So what do you think, what's drawing young people to poetry, and what is the role of poetry in the world today?
Wow, that's a great question, Nick. There was a time not too recently where it seemed that poetry was fading on a national level. There were a lot of magazines and journals that had been going for years and years that suddenly stopped. But I think the opposite. What began to happen is that on local levels, in states and in towns and cities, poetry continued. And now I think it's an incredibly vibrant outlet for people of any age and all over the place. And so, I submit my stuff. I've been published, around the world and all over this country with editors who are half my age, sometimes a third my age. And we have this connection. And recently it occurred to me that almost every one of us were exposed to poetry with nursery rhymes. As children, our parents were reading us poems. And that's how a lot of us first opened books, was because of these little rhyming stories. Mother Goose. Those are poems. And I think that will never die. What I like to say is, if you have a heartbeat, you could write a poem because your body has a beat. And poetry in the old days, like Shakespeare's time, the beat was iambic pentameter. And so if I was going to teach someone how to write a poem, I would just say, listen to your pulse, pay attention, write words, and use that as almost like a soundtrack to begin, just to begin. And then someone like Allen Ginsberg or Walt Whitman, Gary Snyder's another, they use the breath instead of a beat. We all breathe. Take a breath. On the exhale, fill that exhale with words. Write them down. Do it again. Do it again. You might be writing a poem. So you don't necessarily need to have a master's in creative writing from a college or something, And it's very encouraging to see, again, because I publish and I read all kinds of journals, lots and lots of folks who are 2 generations away from me who are getting the same exact joy that I do after having been doing it for 50, 60 years,
Well, that's very cool to hear. Folks might be hearing the Carousel has just opened its doors. It is 11 a.m. on Thursday, July 9th. And so you may be hearing the Carousel come to life behind you. I did want to ask, you're talking about there's this inherent meter and rhythm to our bodies, whether through our breath or through our heartbeat. And there's also an inherent meter and rhythm to the Carousel. So have you thought about the poetry of the Carousel or those rhythms? Could you tell me about that?
Well, for me, the rhythms of the carousel have a lot to do with music. And I'm a musician and I write music and I write songs. So I write lyrics, which of course to me is poetry as well. But, and we have different roles for the Wurlitzer that play different kinds of music. But I sort of do a dance when the carousel's going and that music is playing. And in between rides, we have a selection of CDs that we can play. Some of the operators like no music in between rides. They like the quiet so they could really talk to people more attentively. I like to have those songs playing. A lot of them are oldies, so they're in the public domain. And I because I'm in a band, I will sing along as I'm walking around, and I'm just singing the songs that are playing. But there's it's a beautiful musical experience. And when I talk about the Wurlitzer, and a lot of people talk to me about the Wurlitzer, they want to know about this machine they just heard playing while they were spinning around. And I often will say, in one sense, the Wurlitzer is like the star of the show because it's directing how you feel. I mean, you have your own feelings once they've heard the story from me, once they're getting the awe of the animals, but then the soundtrack directs another part of the experience. I've seen, again, tiny, tiny babies who shouldn't be knowing how to do this, who are bopping their head to the music and don't even know how to clap their hands yet. I mean, that young. And I'll point it out to the parents and they'll look at me like, wow, they're really digging the music. So it's a musical experience that's as powerful as the stories to me. It's the totality of the whole thing. I mean, it really affects every sense. Seeing it, because I know people who've said to me, I saw it on TV, I've seen it in the newspaper, but seeing it in person, that's a whole different thing.
Yeah.
So that's a completely different thing. That's visual. Then you have oral, you have that music that goes on. You have the interaction of hundreds of people or dozens of people all laughing together, the way you would at an audience of a show where you're, sharing this experience with strangers. So it hits on every level.
Yeah, it really does. It's a very full sensory experience. Maybe no taste, hopefully. All right, great. Well, so I'm kind of thinking towards landing this plane. So I'd like to kind of ask you a little bit of like where can we find you? What, give any kind of, or a way to connect with you further.
Sure. Well, I'm at the Carousel Monday afternoons, Friday afternoons, Saturday morning. If you want to interact with me, meet me, hear my way of telling the carousel story, that's when I'm here. I'm also in a band. We're called the CBDs. We're medicinal music, and we're good for what ails you, we say.
Okay.
And I think I'm doing a reading. At some point, the carousel's supposed to be doing a reading.
Oh, cool.
Where I'm working with Sarah on that. And I'll read a lot more poems than just about the carousel. And there are two poets. One I mentioned in a way earlier, a young guy in his early 30s, who I've known since he was yay big, will be reading. And then another brilliant poet from Gilpin County will also be joining me. So far, there's three of us.
Well, and the best way to get your books is just to come right into the carousel.
Come into the carousel, I'll sign them for you, and I'll tell you a good story about the books.
Love it. I'd love to kind of close it out on one of your poems.
So this was my wife's favorite poem of the book. What I see occasionally at the carousel are babies who are pre-speech, not walking yet, barely understand what they've just experienced by riding the carousel with their family, their parents, or an extended family. Yet when they leave, they throw a fit that they can't articulate to their parents. And I used to just think, just get this kid out of here already, but then I realized, no, they're communicating on some level. And so this is about that. The first life lesson arrives unexpected, unasked for, and unknown to these tiny new humans. Why does the ride have to end? They cannot even ask the question, being pre-speech beings living on pure sensory input, integration, digestion, and overload. But they know to react in horror when the Wurlitzer stops, when they're being taken away, when they point and scream, a kind of crying, panicked pleading, a desperation, a sudden void where there had been such joy. Why does the ride have to end? Why do we have to get off? Why does the music stop? False answers offer distraction from the sudden subtraction. We have to make room for others to ride, or time for donuts, pizza, the park, the party, grandma's house, to see Santa, or the parade, or because they're closing. See, the operators sweeping, the animals will soon be sleeping. But none of these answers have any effect. There is only the absence now that must be filled again, a space where there had been such a something, so unknown till now, so needed, and the cries and tears, the thrashing and pounding on shoulders, fighting the stroller or the backpack, trying to get the message across, begging for some answer to a question barely born in one so young. Why does the ride have to end?
Every carousel ride must come to an end, just like every podcast episode. But poems themselves have a way of continuing long after their final stanza, sticking with you, taking up residence, and starting a life of their own. But first you have to invite the poetry in. As the French essayist Joseph Joubert said, you will find poetry nowhere unless you bring some of it with you. So before you leave the house today, be sure to grab your keys, your phone, your wallet, and take some poetry too. You never know when you might need it. If you'd like to read Burt's books, The Poetry of the Carousel and From Where We Came, you can find them prominently featured at the Carousel of Happiness gift shop or on our website. You can listen to Burt's band, the CBDs, at their upcoming shows or by visiting their website, thecbds.com. You'll find links to all of this in the show notes. We're still finalizing the details of the poetry reading at the Carousel that Burt referenced, so keep an eye on the events page of our website, or better yet, follow us on Instagram and Facebook and subscribe to our email newsletter to be the first to know when we've set a date. If you're more comfortable in front of an easel than a typewriter, come to our Paint and Spin event on August 14th. It's hosted by another carousel operator, C.B. Miller, our resident artist, who you just might hear on an upcoming episode. Our next guest, I'm honored to say, is the Carousel's founder and carver, Scott Harrison himself. He told me about the first animal he carved and the works that he's completed since finishing the Carousel.
A lot of people come into the Carousel overwhelmed by the loud music and all the noise of the yelling of the kids and everybody talking loud as they're surprised and having fun at the carousel going around. For many people, it's hard for them. It's hard to digest so much stimulus. So I decided to build a quiet way for people to sit with life-size wooden animals.
He also played for me a music box, just like the one that inspired and comforted him all those decades ago in Vietnam. You heard it earlier at the end of our interview. I'm looking forward to sharing that conversation with you and continuing this broader conversation about art and why it's so vital. In the meantime, take care, be well, and as we like to say at the Carousel of Happiness, don't delay joy. And we'll see you next time around.
Beginnings and endings are only pretendings. I'll see you next time around. I'll see you